We begin with a look at the calendar. Today is August 28th, a day with a lot of implications for the people of Missouri. It's 90 days after the end of the legislative session, and by state rules, it's the first day new laws can go into effect. One of them brings big changes when it comes to elections in the Show Me State. It passed through Jeff City as House Bill 1878. It means the Secretary of State can now review the list of registered voters or voter rolls in any jurisdiction to make sure the lists are being maintained. Election machines are now required to be air-gapped, meaning they can't be directly connected to the internet. And all electronic machines will be phased out by 2024 in favor of a paper ballot, except for people with disabilities who need to use machines to vote. There is a compromise made with state Democrats. The law allows 2 weeks of no excuse in-person absentee voting, and you don't have to meet a specific list of criteria to vote early during that time. We're not done. There's another aspect of this law that affects every single Missouri voter. You are now required to show a photo ID at the polls, and it has to be a current, non-expired government-issued photo ID, like a Missouri driver's license, state ID, passport, federal ID. In the past, you could vote with your voter ID card, a student ID from a Missouri state school, or even a current utility bill or bank statement. That is no longer the case. People who show up to the polls without a valid ID can still cast what's called a provisional ballot, but those ballots will only be counted if the voter returns by the end of Election Day with a photo ID, or if an election official verifies their signature. All this information will be listed on the Secretary of State's website starting today. You might be thinking, doesn't everybody have an ID? Well, the answer is a resounding no. Numbers pulled in 2017 by the Missouri Secretary of State's office show more than 137,000 registered Missouri voters did not have a state-issued ID. Another 140,000 voters had expired licenses. 2,000 had forfeited their licenses. So by that count, nearly 280,000 voters would be affected by these new requirements. Though the Secretary of State's office tells me the state has given out thousands of IDs to Missourians in the years since then. Still, that disparity is why civil rights and voter protection groups are suing the state. They're concerned these new requirements go too far and limit voting rights. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is bringing 2 lawsuits against the state of Missouri on behalf of the Missouri NAACP and the ACLU of Missouri. One will challenge changes to voter registration and absentee voting provisions. The other takes the new photo ID requirements to task.
I believe that House Bill 1878 is intended and designed to deter participation in Missouri's voting processes, particularly for underserved communities, for our seniors, for voters with disabilities, for communities of color, for low-wage workers, for students. It stands to dramatically impact Missourians' access to the ballot.
Despite the criticism, polling from last year suggests most Americans support voter ID laws. The Pew Research Center found 61% of Democrats surveyed and 93% of Republicans are in favor of such requirements. Joining me now to get to the heart of the matter is Greg Vanami, Associate Professor, Political Science Department Chair at UMKC. Greg, thanks for coming on the program. We know there are so many changes here and that lawmakers have done this before. They've worked in the past several times to require voter IDs, didn't really get traction until now. The state Supreme Court had gotten involved at one point. Is this law any different, and how do you anticipate this moving forward?
Yeah, so how this law differs is previously laws have passed by the legislature and through constitutional amendment, but they've been undone by the courts. So this is sort of the final effort to probably the final effort to address the concerns that the courts have had to get a voter ID law that will pass legal muster with the state courts. I could potentially foresee some legal challenges to other aspects of the law, but in terms of would there be other legal issues that would come up for photo ID, I think this law is pretty robust. There may be challenges, but I would anticipate, if I were a Missouri voter going forward, that this is probably going to be the lay of the land. You
know, when we look at this, especially when it comes to voter ID, how does this help the democratic process and get out the vote? Because critics claim it's doing the opposite here.
Yeah, so this is part of the fraud versus access. So voter ID laws are part of the fraud versus access debate. So on the one hand, proponents of voter ID laws argue that this is important to ensure fair elections where we don't have voter impersonation corrupting the count. Critics of these laws usually argue that these are efforts at vote suppression that prevent legitimate voters from participating in the process. There's also a partisan divide there, right? So there's strategy behind that, you know, to the extent that Republicans sometimes view this as being advantageous for them. Democrats sometimes view this as being disadvantageous for them electorally. What we know from the scholarship is it doesn't matter that much. So the fraud versus access debate, scholars have looked at that. There's virtually no voter impersonation. One study found that rates of voter impersonation were statistically indistinguishable from reported rates of alien abduction. I mean, this is just not.
Doesn't happen.
It's just not a major concern in the American electoral process. And I would hope that nobody viewing this program would distrust the American electoral process for fear of voter impersonation.
Well, and yet we've seen that over the past couple of years, though.
Well, and so that's the other thing that you can
The distrust, not the actual person.
Exactly, and then the reason for that, you can sort of decompose concerns about voter fraud from voter impersonation. ID laws are really only intended to address voter impersonation, which is almost never happens. On the other side, does it suppress votes? There are some studies that suggest that there is some suppression effect, particularly among minority voters, but there are just as many studies that show that sometimes it increases turnout, sometimes it's sort of a net wash.
Mm-hmm. So clear winners and losers in this? Who does this help? Who does it hurt? You say it's, like you said, it's a wash.
No. The way I would understand this in terms of winners or losers, I would understand this from the party perspective as it puts a greater impetus on the campaigns to inform their voters and to mobilize their voters to make sure that they understand the rules and actually produce the correct IDs. If one party is more successful at doing that than the other, then that's going to give them the advantage. But going in, does this inherently help Republicans or Democrats? No.
Okay. We know Missouri Secretary of State kind of touted praise from the America First Policy Institute. If you didn't know, it's a right-wing think tank founded by former Trump advisors, claiming that Missouri is a leader in election security. Do any of these new protections in the law make elections more secure? And was this even an issue? We touched on this a second ago. We haven't seen major violations of election security in the past.
Yes, and certainly, so there are I think there are 18 other states right now that have similar photo ID laws. They all vary a little bit in terms of their provisions, but other states are already doing this, so we sort of know from their experiences how these things operate. There are also other election security aspects of the law, but that's not something that voters would necessarily see. That applies to what the Secretary of State is empowered to do in terms of auditing voter lists, and there are some additional restrictions on election equipment that'll be in polling places going forward.
Bottom line, we only have a few seconds left. What should voters take with them, other than their IDs, to the polls? What's the takeaway here?
Two things to know for November. Bring your photo IDs to the polls, and there's also a 2-week early voting period, in-person early voting period.
Right, which was a compromise, but as you said, not much of one, because you could already do that if you signed an affidavit before.
Right, yeah, one potentially limiting access, one measure potentially expanding access.
All right, we appreciate your time. Greg Vanami with UMKC, thank you very much.
Thank you.